Family, I want to take a breath with you before we even begin, because what I'm about to share is heavy and it deserves more than just headlines and sound bites. It deserves our full attention, our open hearts, and the space to grieve, reflect, and understand. Let me ask you this. What does justice look like when a Black man's life is taken in hate, when a family is left to mourn, and when the system finally speaks, but the voice of the one who was silenced can never return? That question lingers tonight, and it begins with a tragedy that unfolded in Nacogdoches, Texas. A man named Melvin Ray Rogers Jr., just 40 years old, known by those who loved him for his smile, his kindness, and his sweet spirit, was gunned down in his own home garage. He was a father, a friend, a son, a man who deserved to live. But his story ended at the hands of a young man fueled by hate, rage, and the poison of racism. The man responsible, Madison Measle Simmons, was only 17 years old at the time, 17, barely out of childhood, and yet carrying inside him a venom so deep that when a confrontation months earlier didn't go his way, he decided the only solution was bloodshed. Let's rewind to that moment. Months before the murder, there was an encounter. Simmons had used a racial slur toward Rogers, a word heavy with centuries of degradation, violence, and dehumanization. Rogers, in defense of his own dignity, slapped Simmons. That slap was not just about one man's pride. It was a rejection of hatred, a demand for respect, a refusal to let ugliness pass unchecked. But Simmons couldn't let it go. Instead, he carried the grudge like a weapon waiting for its moment. On December 21st, 2020, he chose that moment. Armed with a 5.56 millimeter rifle, he drove to Rogers' home, and then, in an act of pure cruelty, he sprayed the house with 30 rounds of ammunition. 30 bullets, tearing through wood, metal, glass, bullets, tearing through the sanctity of a family home. Several of those bullets struck Rogers, ending his life in his own garage, the very place where a man should feel safe. When investigators arrived, they found Rogers unresponsive. They collected casings scattered like cold reminders of violence, and they began piecing together what had happened. Months later, when they searched Simmons' home for an unrelated case, they found the rifle. Forensic tests confirmed it. This was the weapon that fired the rounds, the weapon that took a life, the weapon that turned a family's world upside down. Simmons was arrested during a traffic stop in February 2021, and now, years later, the trial finally began. The jury listened. The prosecutors presented. The evidence was undeniable. And when it came time to decide, the state offered a plea deal, 40 years in prison. Simmons accepted. The Rogers family, patient and dignified despite their grief, agreed to that outcome. And so a young man who chose hate and vengeance will spend the next 4 decades behind bars. Now let's sit with that for a moment. 40 years, a lifetime stretched across cold walls and steel doors, but also a lifetime stolen from the man who will never come home again. And this, family, is where I want to pause. Not on the shooter, not on his sentence, but on the man we lost. Because on a GoFundMe page created to honor him, those who loved Melvin Rogers described him in simple, beautiful words: sweet disposition, smile, kindness. Those are not small things. In a world that so often tries to harden us, to make us cynical and cold, to steal our softness, a man known for kindness is a man who carried light. That light was extinguished not because of anything he did wrong, but because someone else could not stand to see him live in dignity. And that's the part that cuts deep, because we know this story is not isolated. Across this country, Black lives have been taken in moments that began with words, looks, slights, moments where racism spoke and violence answered. What should have been a disagreement resolved with words became a death sentence because hate always multiplies when it's not confronted. Family, let's reflect on the layers here. Simmons was 17 years old and already comfortable using racial slurs. 17 years old and already ready to kill over pride. 17 years old and already carrying the lessons of a culture that too often feeds young white boys the lie that their anger is justified, that their supremacy is natural, that violence can restore their ego. That is learned behavior. That is not born in the soul. It is planted, watered, and nurtured by the soil of racism. And on the other side, we have a 40-year-old Black man, a man in his prime, who had lived enough life to know the sting of disrespect and the weight of survival. He stood up for himself in that earlier moment, but he could not have known the price he would later pay. That's the horror of racism. It doesn't just wound in the moment. It stalks, it festers, it waits for its opportunity. The sentencing, 40 years, may feel like justice to some, but for the family of Rogers, justice would look like him still alive, laughing, smiling, and living his life. Sentences do not bring back breath. They do not heal the empty chair at the dinner table. They do not erase the memory of that night, bullets flying into a home where safety should have lived. And so we are left with this tension, accountability delivered, but justice incomplete. This is the story of Black survival in America. Time after time, when our dignity is attacked, when our humanity is insulted, we stand up. And time after time, the response is punishment, violence, erasure. From lynchings in the past to shootings in the present, the script feels achingly familiar, but still we survive. Still, we fight to tell the truth, to honor the names, to demand better. And I want to say this, it matters that prosecutors called this what it was, a racially charged dispute. Because too often, the system refuses to speak the word racism. Too often, hate crimes get swept into the pile of just another tragedy. But naming it matters. Saying out loud that a man's life was stolen because of a slur, a slap, and a grudge rooted in injustice, that matters. It sets the record straight. But I also know that naming doesn't undo mourning. The Rogers family will carry this forever. And yet, they showed grace. They accepted the plea. They chose patience, understanding, dignity in the face of devastation. That kind of grace is not weakness. It is strength beyond measure. To stand in a courtroom, look at the man who took your loved one, and still choose resolution over revenge, that is power. That is love. Family, we must honor that. We must hold their example close, not because they should have had to show that strength, but because they did. And in doing so, they remind us that Black families, time and time again, carry the burden of grace when we should be the ones receiving justice without compromise. Now let's talk about Melvin Rogers again, because too often, victims get reduced to statistics. We hear their names in headlines, but we don't hear their laughter, their stories, their humanity. I want us to picture him as more than a victim. He was a man with a sweet disposition. That means he probably had a gentle way about him, a kindness that made people feel at ease. His smile, remembered by so many, was likely the kind of smile that could brighten a room. And his kindness, family kindness, is a legacy. When people remember you for kindness, that means you gave pieces of yourself freely. You left behind warmth, you left behind light. That is how we must remember him, not as a headline, but as a human being. And in remembering him, we must also reflect on what this says about us as a society. A 17-year-old carried enough hate to kill. A 40-year-old carried enough love to be remembered for kindness. That is the contrast of America right there, the poison of racism sitting alongside the resilience of Black life. The tragedy is that the poison too often steals the light. But here's what I believe deep in my soul. Light cannot be extinguished, not truly. Melvin Rogers' life may have been cut short, but his memory shines on. In his family's love, in the community's remembrance, in the story we tell tonight. That is the way we resist erasure, by speaking the names, by telling the stories, by keeping the light alive. So what do we do with this? We grieve, we honor, we reflect, but we also recommit. We recommit to challenging racism wherever it shows its face, whether in words spoken at school, in attitudes passed down at the dinner table, or in policies that shape lives. Because racism is not just one act, one slur, one shooting. It is a system. And every time we confront it, every time we refuse to let it slide, we chip away at its power. 40 years in prison will not heal the wound, but maybe, just maybe, it will remind somebody out there that hate has consequences. Maybe it will stop another young man from picking up a gun. Maybe it will spark a conversation in one household about the poison of slurs and the power of respect. And if it does, then perhaps Melvin Rogers' story will not be in vain. As we close tonight, I want us to carry his memory with reverence. Let his kindness remind us to be kind. Let his smile remind us to smile through the darkness. Let his sweet disposition remind us that gentleness is not weakness. It is strength wrapped in love. And let his story remind us that we still have work to do. Family justice was handed down in the courtroom, but true justice lives in the way we change our culture, the way we confront hate, the way we honor the lives stolen too soon. Let us honor Melvin Rogers Jr. not only by remembering how he died, but by remembering how he lived, with kindness, with a smile, with love. And may his light, though extinguished too soon, continue to shine in us all.